So usually when people have whiny gearboxes and their gears are shimmed well, usually it's a problem of meshing between the bevel gear and the pinion gear. So most, if you look on YouTube, most pinion guides, I'm sorry, shimming guides now will recommend shimming starting from the bevel and the pinion gear. But some older guides recommend you shim the sector gear, I mean the spur gear as low as possible. Um, you know, but basically, yeah. So I think your issue is, my guess is, assuming you've shimmed everything properly, and you've tested with all the screws in the gearbox and the gearbox closed, and obviously you want the gears to be as close as possible but not touching, and you don't want them to be too tight. You want just a tiny bit of play, not much though, but just a tiny bit. So assuming that's all correct, and theoretically, you have your gearbox shell and no other components in it, just the gears and the gearbox shell, and you can spin it, and it spins well, and you can turn it on either side, and there's no scraping. Assuming that's the case, your problem is probably the meshing between the bevel gear and the pinion gear. So first off, some brands don't play nice with each other. So if it's a stock motor and a stock bevel gear, they're designed to mesh together, and they should be fine. Some brands are just loud regardless, but usually you want to check to make sure your pinion gear is aligned correctly with the bevel gear. And so this is an example of improper alignment, and all the way up here is an example of improper alignment. You want it to be like that. See how there's that little gap? So you want it to be, let me see if I can get this up there. You want it to be like that. So as much of the pinion is on the bevel gear as possible without it being too far forward. So one of the ways you can do this is you can take the top half of your gearbox, with your gearbox apart, put your bevel gear in there, and then let's see if I can turn this around. And then so go ahead and screw the motor grip on, and put the motor in, put the end cap on, and then just pretend it's on. And so your motor's in here like that. And then you can use, I'm sure you know this, but you can use the screw in the end of the motor to adjust how far in the motor is, the height of the motor. And so when you do that, you can look to see, you can kind of, with that other half of the shell off, you can look to see how far in it is. And again, you want it to be like that, about. Basically, you just want as much of the pinion gear to be meshing on the bevel gear as possible, without it being too far in. So the other problem can be then the height of the bevel gear. So imagine our pinion gear is, it was like this, it was really whiny, and now it's perfect like that. Now the other thing, you got to take care of that first. The other thing to consider is how high the bevel gear is. If there are too many shims on the top, then it's going to be pressing too hard against the motor, and that's going to cause your motor to heat up, and your rate of fire to slow. My guess is that yours might be too high, but that's just a guess. So when it's too high, when you have too many shims on the bottom, then it's up just a little bit too far, and it's not making full contact. So instead of the gears going like this, how they're supposed to, they go like this. So I don't know if that visual aid helps. But that's basically it. So assuming your other gears are shimmed correctly, check how far the pinion is, and make sure it's meshing with the bevel gear correctly, and then check the height of the bevel gear. And one way you can sort of see if your bevel gear is too high or too low is you have the bevel gear in, you have your pistol grip attached, your motor in, screwed in and everything. And then you can kind of, so pretend I have the other half of the gearbox. If it's too tight, then when you press on the top and the bottom, the bevel gear won't move. So you want just a tiny bit of movement. I would say once you have a tiny bit of movement, put a 0.1 millimeter shim on the top, so it's just right. And it's kind of hard to explain, but you'll just have to experiment. So yeah, I hope that helps.